My name is Annika, and I'm 31 years old. 8 years ago, my parents sat across from me at their kitchen table and gave me a choice: find a residential program for my 2-year-old son, my son with Down syndrome, or lose every form of support they'd been providing. I kept him. They kept their word. They withdrew the help, took back the car they'd been paying for, and spent the next 8 years building a version of events in which I was the cold, distant daughter who had vanished with their grandson for reasons no one could name. Last March, a composition Nico wrote won the Harrington Prize for Young Composers, and a licensing deal placed $1.8 million in a trust bearing his name. He was 15 years old. 7 weeks later, my parents arrived at my attorney's office with a man named Philip Strand from a firm called Delacroix and Strand, and they had a list of what they believed they were owed. I didn't raise my voice. I told my attorney, a woman named Drew Facette, who has the kind of stillness that makes a room pay attention, let them say all of it. What happened in that conference room dismantled every story they had spent 8 years building. If you're watching this, please subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. The call came about a week after the prize announcement, not from my parents, from my father's sister. She left a voicemail that was 4 minutes long and included the phrase, "Your mother is beside herself with pride." I listened to it twice on the way to pick Nico up from school, and then I sat in the parking lot with my hands on the wheel until I could get my face right before he saw me. My parents didn't know Nico. They hadn't been in the same room with him since he was 2 years old. What they knew was the version they'd assembled from the outside. A prize announcement in the regional paper. A photograph Drew had approved of him at the piano, with his back to the camera. They had built beside themselves with pride out of the back of my son's head. I noticed that, and I kept noticing it. But I'm ahead of myself. What happened in that room doesn't make sense without what came before it, and what came before it is 8 years long. Nico's father left before there was a diagnosis to respond to. I'll say that now and move past it, because I know it's the first thing people wonder. We were 22. We'd been together for 2 years. When Nico started missing developmental markers at 10 months, his father started putting distance between himself and both of us, the way someone edges toward an exit before the fire alarm has even gone off. By the time the geneticist confirmed Down syndrome, Nico was 13 months old and his father had already moved back to his parents' house in another state. He sent birthday cards for 3 years, then those stopped too. I have not spoken to him since Nico was 4. He is not part of this story, and I want to say that plainly. What I had instead was my parents. My mother, who kept a careful accounting of every disappointment anyone had ever handed her, and my father, who mostly agreed with whatever position she had most recently staked out. They were present in those first months. They came to appointments. My mother held Nico with real tenderness. I think some part of her tried, genuinely, to love him the way I was already loving him, which was without condition or exit strategy. Then someone at her church said something. I don't know what, exactly. I only know that it shifted something in her, and that shift never fully reversed. She started talking about appearances, about what was realistic, about the kind of grandmother she had pictured herself being, and how she was adjusting expectations. She said that phrase often enough that I started hearing it as a signal. That the conversation happened on a Sunday night, at the kitchen table I had eaten breakfast at every morning growing up. Nico was asleep on a blanket in the living room. My mother waited until his breathing was even, and then she began. She had researched programs, she said. Good ones. There was a residential center called Sycamore Ridge in the next county that specialized in children with developmental delays, and she had already contacted them for an informational packet. She said it without apology. The way someone tells you they've already chosen the paint color for a room you live in. My father sat at the end of the table and said nothing. His silence was its own kind of answer. I'd spent enough time with it by then to understand what it meant. He wanted things to go a particular way, and he wanted my mother to be the one to arrange them. She said that she and my father could not, in good conscience, keep supporting a path that wasn't sustainable. The monthly help, the car, the insurance access until I could secure my own. She wasn't threatening, she said. She was being honest about what was possible. I sat there for a moment, looking at the fruit bowl in the center of the table. There was a pear in it that had gone soft. I remember thinking I should have noticed it when I arrived. I said, "I'm not placing him anywhere." She looked at me the way you look at a fuse you've already lit, steady and waiting. I drove home with Nico asleep in the back seat, and I let myself feel the floor drop out from under me for the length of exactly 1 block. Then I didn't feel it anymore. I just drove. 3 weeks later, a packet arrived from Sycamore Ridge Developmental Center. I had not contacted them. Inside was an intake questionnaire and a cover letter referencing prior correspondence from a family member. Folded inside was a copy of the intake submission my mother had sent. She had described Nico's needs in careful clinical language. She had listed herself as the primary family contact. She had not listed me at all. I called Sycamore Ridge. I told them I was his mother. And this was over. Then, because I already understood that paper was the only language I could trust, in a conflict like this one, I photocopied everything and put it in a shoebox on the top shelf of my bedroom closet. I told myself I would never need it. I moved us 60 miles south to Indianapolis the following month. I had a job offer at a medical administration firm, a 1-bedroom apartment with a radiator that clicked when the heat came on, and about $400 more than I needed for the deposit. What you learn, raising a child alone on a budget with no margin in it, is that there is no such thing as a normal Tuesday. Every Tuesday has its own arithmetic. I worked mornings at the medical office and 2 evenings a week at a hotel front desk, and in the hours between, I was learning Nico, not managing him, learning him, the way you learn a language you weren't born into until it stops feeling foreign. I learned that sound was something he processed with his whole body, that certain frequencies settled him, and others made him go rigid in a way that looked like stubbornness, but was actually discomfort. I learned that he needed to understand the why before he could agree to the how. He didn't trust instructions without reasons, which made him difficult in the eyes of people who believed instructions should simply be followed, and which would make him, I later understood, exactly the kind of mind that could build something original. He started piano at 6. Not because I had a plan for it, but because the community center 2 blocks from us ran a music program on Tuesday afternoons, sliding scale $15 a month, and I needed somewhere he could be for 90 minutes during a work call I couldn't reschedule. The woman who ran the program was named Nettie Garland. She was in her 60s, retired, and she taught the way some people pray, with her whole attention and no part of it held back. The first Tuesday, she sat with Nico for the full 90 minutes and did not once look at the clock. When I came to pick him up, she was showing him how to find middle C, and he was showing her how he had already mapped the distance between middle C and the note that sounded like the word cold to him. She told me later that was a perfect fifth. She didn't look at me with that particular expression people put on when they want credit for being patient. She just said, "He hears things in colors, it's not a metaphor, he actually does." That was the sentence that opened a door I didn't know was there. Nettie stayed with us for 3 years until the center lost its funding, and she moved to be near her daughter. She never charged me more than I could afford, and she never made me feel the weight of that. On her last day, she wrote down the name of a youth conservatory program on a piece of paper and pressed it into my hand. "Push for this," she said. "Don't let the paperwork stop you." The paperwork nearly stopped me. I pushed anyway. Nico composed his first original piece at 10. He had been playing for 4 years and had won 2 small youth competitions, both of which required me to sit in the audience making my face do something calm, while internally I was not calm at all. The first piece was 11 measures. He called it gray. When I asked why, he said the color he heard when he played, it wasn't quite any color he had a word for. He let me hear it twice. The second time, I sat on the floor with my back against the piano and closed my eyes. It was the most complete thing I had experienced in years. Around that time, Nico asked about my parents. He had asked once when he was 5, "Where are Grandma and Grandpa?" And I'd given him the answer you give a 5-year-old, soft around the edges, nothing sharp in it. He hadn't mentioned them again until now. He was 10, and asking not like a child reaching towards something that hurt him, but like someone methodically gathering information. I told him the truth, most of it, that they had wanted things to go a different way, that we had disagreed, that I had chosen him. I told him they lived in a town called Weston. He thought about that for a while. He does this, turns a question over until it's the right shape before he answers. "Did I ever meet them?" he asked. "When you were very little," I said. He nodded and turned back to the piano. 6 months later, without saying anything to me about it, he started making cards. He announced one Saturday morning, flat, already decided, that he wanted to send his grandparents something for the holidays. He made it himself from cardstock and green pen. We walked to the blue mailbox on the corner and he sent it. It came back. I told him the post office sometimes made mistakes. He looked at me the way he looks at things that don't add up and let it go. He sent 2 more. They came back. I kept them in the shoebox. He stopped after the 3rd one. He didn't announce the stopping. One day he just didn't mention the mailbox. And then a week passed without it. And then it had been a month, and I understood he had made a decision without advertising it. What I didn't understand was that he had also started building something. He called the piece Unaddressed. He worked on it for the better part of a year, between 11 and 12, and he didn't play it for me until it was finished. By finished, I mean until it was exactly what he heard in his head, which for Nico is a standard that doesn't negotiate. It was 22 minutes, 3 movements. The first was sparse. Single notes with significant distance between them, the way a sentence sounds when someone is deciding whether to finish it. The second built and then interrupted itself over and over, a pattern that felt like reaching and not landing. The third resolved, but not triumphantly. It resolved the way a room quietes after everyone has gone. I sat on the floor when he played it for me. I couldn't speak for a few minutes. "What is it about?" I asked when I could. He turned the question over. "Things that were sent," he said, and came back. I thought he meant something general. Something about longing in the abstract, the broad texture of missed connection. He was 12 and building elaborate inner worlds out of the material the world had handed him. I didn't realize he meant it specifically, precisely, down to the color of the ink on the return stamps. I would not realize it until the morning he opened that shoebox in front of a room full of lawyers. The conservatory program submitted Unaddressed to the Harrington Prize without telling me they were doing it. I found out from an email the day before the announcement. A heads up from the program director who wanted to make sure I wasn't blindsided. I read it at 7 in the morning standing in my kitchen, and then I sat down on the floor and stayed there until Nico came in for breakfast and found me. "Why are you on the floor?" he asked. "I'm thinking," I said. "On the floor. It helps sometimes." He accepted this and poured his cereal. When the prize was announced, music critics described Unaddressed as a meditation on silence as response, a study in the emotional weight of things never received. The licensing offer came 4 weeks later from a film score publisher who wanted the third movement for a project about generational distance. The deal went through a trust in Nico's name. I was the custodian. My job was to protect it and not touch it. I did not deviate from that by 1 cent. The regional paper ran a short piece. They used Nico's name because he was now a public figure in the specific world where 15-year-old composers are public figures, but they used a photograph of him from behind. His shoulders, the back of his head, nothing a stranger could identify on the street. It ran with a pull quote from the licensing company. I approved the exact wording. In Weston, someone read that article and did a different kind of math with it. My mother called. I still had the same number. She left a message, warm in the way warmth can sometimes be a form of strategy, telling me she and my father had thought of Nico every single day, that family finds its way back to itself, that she hoped I was open to talking. She used the word share twice before she said his name once. I noted the order. 17 days later, a letter arrived from Delacroix and Strand. The language was careful, the way a closed door is careful. My parents sought recognition of their role as grandparents and compensation for prior support. And given the scale of the financial arrangement now attached to their minor grandson, they felt a neutral party might be better suited to serve his interests as custodian. I underlined neutral party and his interests with a pen, and I took the letter to Drew. She read it slowly, set it down, told me what I already partly knew. We could fight it loudly, or we could let them build their case out loud in their own words, on the record, with a witness present, and then let the evidence speak. Words committed to the record are easier to disprove than feelings that float unchallenged through family stories for years. Let them talk. Nico heard more of the conversation than I intended. He came to the doorway of the living room with his hands in his pockets, the way he does when he's assessing whether I need something. I told him his grandparents had a lawyer, that they were making a claim, that there would be a meeting. He stood in the doorway for a moment. They sent back everything I mailed them, he said. Not a question, a fact being placed on the table between us so we could look at it together. Yes, I said. And now they want the music. No anger in it, no hurt I could locate, just the fact examined and set down. He went back to his room. 2 days before the meeting, he came and found me in the kitchen. He had the shoebox. He told me he'd found it the year before, had been up on a chair reaching for something on the high shelf, and it had tilted and he'd caught it and looked inside. He'd known for a year. He hadn't said a word. He sat at the kitchen table and opened it, and began arranging the returned cards in a line, from oldest to newest, and I watched him do it. I want to be in that room, he said. You don't have to be. I know. He put his hand flat on the stack of cards. I want to be there. He said it the way he says things he's already decided, words already finished before his mouth opened. I said, okay. He spent the next 2 days adding one thing to the box. I watched him seal a plain white envelope and set it on top of everything else. On the front, in his careful handwriting, he had written 4 words. I read them. I did not ask. There are things you wait for a person to give you in their own time, and I could tell, without being told, that this was one of them. My parents arrived at Drew's office at 10 in the morning. My father's sister was with them, invited by my parents as a family witness, which told me they were confident of her. She had believed their version for 8 years. She had no particular reason not to. My mother walked in and remarked on the light in the conference room. That was her opening. 8 years of silence between us, and she led with a comment about the windows. She did not look at Nico. Not once, in the entire time they were in that room, did she look directly at her grandson. She looked at Drew, at Strand, at me, at the surface of the conference table. She had come to make decisions about his future and question my fitness to guide it, and she could not bring herself to look at his face. Strand opened cleanly. His clients had provided substantial support during a formative period. The estrangement had caused lasting harm. Given the size of the arrangement now attached to their minor grandson, they sought appropriate oversight and raised, with calibrated seriousness, the question of a custodian without formal financial background was the right steward for an arrangement of this magnitude. My mother took the floor. She had been waiting for an audience this attentive. She pulled a tissue from her sleeve before she needed it, and she told everyone in that room how she and my father had tried to stay in Nico's life, how I had shut them out, how they had spent 8 years grieving a grandchild they were not permitted to know, praying every Sunday for their family to be restored, waiting for me to come to my senses. "We never stopped loving him," she said. Her voice did exactly what it was designed to do, broke right on schedule, right on the word him. My father nodded. My aunt, at the far end of the table, nodded the way she had nodded for 8 years at every holiday, in every phone call, in every version of this story my mother had performed for her. Strand closed gently. Whatever the legal particulars, his clients only wanted what was best for the boy. The boy! He said it while gesturing vaguely in Nico's direction without once looking at him, as though Nico were a subject under discussion, and not a person sitting 6 feet away with both hands resting on a shoebox. That was the sentence. Nico put the shoebox on the table. The sound it made was soft, cardboard on wood, but the room heard it. He opened the lid. He took out the cards he had made. Green pen, careful handwriting, small drawings in the corners, and he laid them across the table one by one. A holiday card. A birthday card with a tiny piano sketched at the bottom, each one face up. Each one marked across the front with the same 2 words in dragged red ink. Return to sender. "I made these," he said. His voice was level, completely calm. "I sent them to you. You sent every one of them back." My mother said postal errors happened all the time, that she couldn't explain it. That mail was unreliable. Nico set the next item on the table. The intake submission my mother had sent to Sycamore Ridge. The one inquiring about residential placement for her 2-year-old grandson. The one in her handwriting, from her address, bearing her name under requesting family member. My aunt reached across the table and picked it up. I watched her read it. I watched something revise itself slowly behind her eyes. 8 years of a story she had held, because there was no reason not to, because grief had looked real when she sat across from it at dinner tables. The color of the afternoon changed in her face. She set the letter down. She did not look at my mother. She looked at Nico. Nico took his phone out and set it on the table. He pressed play. The first movement of unaddressed moved through that conference room. Sparse, deliberate, single notes with space between them like words someone is deciding whether to finish. He let it run for 20 seconds. Then he stopped it. He touched the row of returned cards with 2 fingers. "The piece they want a part of," he said, "is about these. I made it from what you sent back." The room was quiet in a way that had weight to it. Strand had nothing. You cannot cross-examine birthday cards marked return to sender. You cannot file a motion against a piece of music that exists because those cards exist. You cannot argue around a placement inquiry in your own client's handwriting, addressed to a facility she claims never to have contacted. There was no position left that didn't require acknowledging what the table was already saying. My father had not spoken once during the entire meeting. He didn't speak now. He looked at the cards and at his sister's face, and then at his own hands in his lap. My mother started a sentence twice. Both times she stopped before the third word. The practiced grief had gone somewhere she couldn't reach it. Drew let the silence sit for a moment. Then she said quietly, "I think we have what we need." The claim was formally withdrawn 9 days later. Strand sent a short letter. No raised letterhead. No careful language. His clients were not pursuing the matter further. The custodial arrangement remained unchanged. Nico's trust sat exactly where it had been, with exactly his name on it and no one else's. My aunt called me the following evening. She told me she had been invited to that room because my parents were certain of her, and she understood now what that certainty had been built on. She said she was sorry. She said she had made it easier for them by not asking harder questions over the years, and that she knew an apology didn't reach back across 8 years and make them shorter. I told her she was right that it didn't. I thanked her for calling. That felt like the true thing to say, and it was all I had. Some of the family found out. Some of them went quiet in the particular way people go quiet when they realize they've been performing someone else's grief on a stage they didn't build and weren't told was a performance. A cousin texted me. He said he'd heard what happened, that he was sorry that he hadn't known to ask harder questions. I told him I appreciated the call. I appreciated the call, and I meant it. And I also didn't rush to make him comfortable, because I had spent 8 years being the one who managed everyone else's comfort, and I was finished with that job. My parents did not contact me. I didn't wait for it. What surprised me was Nico. After the meeting, he seemed lighter in a way I don't have a clean word for. Not triumphant. That would have been too loud, too performance-shaped, and Nico doesn't perform emotions he isn't actually having. Lighter the way you feel when you've been carrying something a long distance and you've set it down in exactly the right place. He went back to the piano 2 days later and started something new. I could hear it from the kitchen, a different quality than his usual work, more settled in the tempo, less interrupted in its phrasing. When I asked him about it, he said he was still figuring out what it was. A week after the meeting, he came and stood in the kitchen doorway, holding the sealed envelope from the shoebox, the one he had added himself, the one he'd never explained. He held it out to me. I looked at what he had written on the front. For the one who stayed. I stopped sending things to them a long time ago, he said. I knew he meant my parents. I knew the exact moment he had stopped. The third card, the third red stamp, the day he walked away from the blue mailbox and simply never mentioned it again. The last thing I made, he said, I made for you. Inside the envelope was a single handwritten page, a short piano score in the notation he had been practicing since he was 9, careful and precise. At the top, in his handwriting, he had written the title, The One Who Showed Up. I sat down at the kitchen table and read it the way you read music when you know enough to hear it in your head, and I heard it, and I did not try to explain what that felt like. He already knew. He has always known more than he says out loud and said more in a single composition than most people manage in years of conversation. My parents spent 8 years writing a story about a daughter who made the wrong choice. My son answered it in a language they never thought to learn. The answer was that I had not gone anywhere. I had been in the same place I had always been, in the gap they left, building something that didn't require their approval to become real. If any part of this reached you, if you've ever chosen a person when your family told you not to, if you've ever been the villain in a story you didn't write, tell me about it in the comments. I read them. Subscribe if you'd like to stay, and I'll see you in the next story. The people who matter are rarely the ones demanding to be recognized. They're usually already in the room, making something out of what they were given, waiting patiently for the rest of the world to catch up.